Hey everyone, heads up, I actually filmed this video last June, right after my first clerkship, but I just now got around to editing it. So without further ado, let's get into the Gyn Clerkship. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now that I'm in the full swing of clinical rotations, I wanted to take a moment to reflect on my first rotation, which was my Gyn Clerkship, Obstetrics Gynecology. Alright, let's get to it. Gyn clerkship was 6 total weeks long. We had 2 weeks on a surgical service. I did gynecology, oncology, and then we did 2 weeks of labor and delivery, 1 week of days and 1 week of nights, and then lastly we had 2 weeks of outpatient service. So I want to start by reflecting on my time on the gynecology oncology service. So this is a surgical service where we deal with a lot of different cancers within the women's reproductive system, hence gynecology oncology. So we dealt a lot with ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, cervical cancer, things like that. So some of my main takeaways were, one, that some of these surgeries were very long. There's a lot of components to it, sometimes lasting up to like 6-8 hours. It can be. I think the longest surgery I was in was around 6 hours. But when you go in and see the tumor, you have to get a sample. Sometimes it's sent off to the surgical pathology where they can do a frozen section to get a sense of what kind of tumor it is. And then sometimes the surgery is also going to involve radical lymph node dissection and staging. So you're taking samples in different lymph nodes to try to get a sense of where the tumor started and where maybe the tumor was spreading to. So this was my first rotation ever, but also my very first surgical type of rotation. So the OR was a very new experience to me. There's a lot to get used to, all the dynamics within there, figuring out what my place is. One thing that I did a lot of was manipulating the uterus. So they have a device that they use to sort of position the uterus while they do the surgeries, and so I would be holding that and maneuvering that to assist the team. One thing that was really cool, I thought, was the cauterization tools that were used. So basically, the team uses electricity to stop bleeding during the surgery, or they'll use that electricity pulse to sort of cut through tissue and structures. And this massively reduces the amount of bleeding involved in surgery. Like a long time ago, they would have had to make actual incisions or cuts and then sew and repair the vessels, and there's a lot more blood loss with that. So that was just one example, I thought, of the revolutionary technological changes we've had within surgery. A lot of the surgeries that I was a part of were laparoscopic hysterectomies, and by laparoscopic we mean it's minimally invasive. So they just make a few incisions in the abdomen, and then they have these robotic arms that they insert through those incisions, and then they do the surgery with the robot, sort of like kind of like a video game console. The surgeons are controlling those, and then the robotic arms are actually doing all the manipulation within the body. And so that was really cool to see, and it was such a privilege to be a part of all those surgeries. Probably my biggest takeaway, though, was some very sage advice I got from one of the attendings in terms of what things to focus on during my time in the operating room. Because at least right now, my sense is I'm probably leaning more towards like internal medicine and not necessarily a procedural field. So the main advice that attending gave me in the OR was to, one, focus on developing these key foundational procedural skills, things like basic suturing, placing a Foley catheter, and those will really sort of be a foundation for me moving forward. And then the other thing that she told me about was to always think about the indications for why a patient is in the operating room. Why was surgery the best option in this scenario? What other options were there to manage the patient? And how did the patient end up here in the OR? So those are definitely some pieces of advice that I will carry with me throughout the rest of my rotations. Okay, next I'm going to talk about my time on labor and delivery. So to be honest, labor and delivery was definitely my favorite part of OB-GYN. and especially being part of the deliveries, on, particularly for these first-time mothers, because it is such a privilege to be there with the mother when they're giving birth, because it's such a profoundly meaningful moment in the mother and her partner and the rest of the family's life, to bring this newborn into the world where you get to be a part of it taking its first breath, and its lungs filling with air and its heart pumping blood throughout its body. Just like, that was incredible and just such a privilege to be a part of. And so another thing that I enjoyed was getting to round on postpartum patients. So after the woman gives birth, and then she goes to the postpartum floor and is there for a few days normally. So the following days I would go in the morning, or sometimes in the afternoon, and just round on the patients that had been part of their deliveries, and then see them on the postpartum ward. And it was so cool to see, and they were so grateful to see me and thank me for being a part of their care, and just to see the joy on their faces with their newborn, really meant a lot to me. Because I was with them, sometimes they were pushing for multiple hours on end, and it's a very arduous process giving birth to a child. So to see them in that joyous time afterwards, that was super cool. Another thing about the labor and delivery service is that it moves at a very rapid pace, at least at the hospital that I was at, because there's so many women giving birth there, so many deliveries going on, and there's so much going on. Like in the team room, they have just a display of all the fetal heart tracings for all the different rooms, and people are running around all the time, and things happen at a very quick pace. So one thing that I got to see actually was a crash C-section, and that was because of a cord prolapse that happened. It was pretty crazy because I was just, standing in the room talking to the patient. Things seemed fine. Then the attending came in and did a cervical check, and then she felt a cord prolapsing. And then they called the code, and the team rushed in, and all of a sudden there were like tons of people in the room, and they rushed the patient to the operating room and do the C-section. So things like that, happen very quickly. Fortunately, I got to be there and witness all this. And one thing to be aware is if you're not always aware of what's going on, it's very easy to miss something going on with your patients. So for example, there was another patient I was following. The fetal heart tones dropped a little bit, and then they ended up having to go in and do a forceps delivery, and that happened so quickly. And I was in the midst of looking at some of my other patients, and I looked up, and next thing I knew, that mother had given birth already. So things happen really quickly and on a very fast time scale in the labor and delivery ward. One little funny thing on labor and delivery service is that a lot of times when we're eating food there, the vessel that we use is actually the emesis bin that they use for the patients. So I felt like it was pretty crazy and also kind of amusing, to be honest. When we're eating some ice cream there in the team room out of these emesis bins. So these are the bins that patients vomit in when they're feeling nauseous. But you do what you gotta do to get that ice cream. Okay, lastly I want to talk about the outpatient clinic service on OB-GYN. So I think the main things that I focused on during that time was developing some key foundational skills relative to OB-GYN and relative to women's health. And those include things like learning how to do a good pelvic exam, which I think is important for all providers to know how to do, as well as learning how to do a Pap test. Basically that's cervical cancer screening. When you take a swab and go around the cervix and inside the os of the cervix to get a sample to see if there's potentially cervical cancer there. And lastly, I learned about the power of ultrasound in the outpatient setting, because with the ultrasound, you can hear the baby's heart rate, and you can hear, the baby's heart beating just from this device that we just put on the outside of the mother's belly. And that is so cool. And also being a part of the ultrasound visits when the mothers come in and they get, their first ultrasound and they find out they're pregnant. One time we were doing that and the mother found out she had twins, actually. So it's such a crazy, advantage of this technology to get to do this non-invasively, and seeing the impact it has on care is remarkable. So overall, OB-GYN was definitely an intense start to my clerkships, but a fantastic time, so much learning, getting to see some really cool stuff, and I did have a lot of fun. So I consider that a success, and I will be looking forward to the rest of my rotations. Thanks everyone for joining me. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.